Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinzler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I am so happy. I love walking around our yard and garden and seeing what's coming on up. And I'm also looking very forward to the planting season because I've been looking through the nursery catalogs and I've been taking some look at the garden centers. And so I've got a wish list of things that I want to plant. And so I'm excited. I can never get enough. There's always so many more things that I want to try. And of course, I think I've mentioned before in this podcast that on my bucket list is to have planted and grown and experienced everything that we can in our northern climate.
How are you doing on that list?
I got a long ways to go with that. I don't have an Ohio buckeye in our yard yet,
okay.
And I don't have a larch. I want a larch tree.
Okay.
And so there's so many things, but that's what I'm working on. So I'm excited to plant things. And, I was kind of thinking, if we think back as to what invention maybe just revolutionized the whole gardening setup, the planting, everything. There's hybrids. Wave petunia was a wonderful thing that was invented. But, thinking back, probably the thing that revolutionized planting and the garden center trade was the invention of plastic.
Plastic? How do you figure?
Plastic. Because think of everything that you plant, everything that you buy at a garden center, they're almost all in a plastic pot.
Yeah.
Or, the little cell packs are plastic, pots are
Makes
plastic.
Them portable. You can take them.
Even a hanging basket, plastic pot.
Yep.
And so before that, and I just barely remember this as a boy, there were the packs that they sold at the garden center were kind of this paper mache type thing, almost like egg carton, that egg carton-y material. And you got this little block of seedlings in that, and you kind of had to separate them out and plant them on out. And some of the nursery material, of course, a lot of it was sold bare root because there wasn't a plastic pot to pot it up and sell it in. And so a lot of the stuff was bare root, and that could only be sold in the spring because you couldn't keep things refrigerated and dormant that long. And some of the pots were actually like a tar paper pot. But when the plastic pot and cell pack was invented, wow, then it made the garden center material available all summer long. We can plant perennials all summer long because you go buy them at the garden center and they're in a really nice plastic pot.
So it really kind of increased the shelf life, the gardening shelf life for people to go out and buy it. You didn't have to hit it just
and
right
so
away.
I consider that probably the best garden invention for a long, long time.
That's pretty impressive. I never really would have thought about that. Plastics. You don't think about plastics in the garden as being a great thing always. But.
Yeah, exactly. And, so anyway, the other thing that I really enjoy is that most of those plastic pots can be reused. Do you have a stack in your
I do.
In your garden?
I do. So some of them I mean to bring to be recycled. Some of them I think I can find a use for that.
Well, yes, exactly. And I've got the stack in our garage too because, I like some of the gallon-sized plastic pot, like you buy a little shrub or something in, because then when I'm moving some of our perennials, I can move them in that. Or if I'm going to give them to someone else, I can pot up a little perennial division, put it in one of the little plastic nursery pots, water it, and that will keep for them until they can take and plant it. So as well as taking them, and some of the plastic pots, I don't know how actual recyclable that plastic is. I'm not sure.
You have to look and see what
the code is on the bottom, but lots of good uses. So anyway, and a lot of the things that we talk about planting today are probably going to be things that we bought or are going to buy in plastic pots.
Well, before we get into talking about planting, let's talk a little bit of just about, you're talking about when you move things in the garden, because we're in that time of the year now, things are starting to come up. Is there anything that you're looking at moving this year? Repositioning?
Yes, there sure is. Funny you should ask. I've got some Shasta daisies, the white Shasta daisies, that ended up in the back of behind our roses. So each year when the roses are blooming really nice, the Shasta daisies are back there somewhere and we can't see them. So Mary suggested, because she loves the Shasta daisies, she said, let's move those out to the front. Nice. I said, well, good idea. So I need to do those fairly quick. The best time is right as they're showing a little growth. Then you know you're transplanting a live clump. but also you want to get them before they get too large and expanded. Otherwise, it tends to set them back. How about you? Are you moving around some stuff in yours?
I think there will be some things we move around, especially some hostas, just kind of spread some things out, things that we've noticed that were maybe a little too crowded last year after we got going. So yeah, we'll be doing some of that. That'll be good.
And of course, I need to make room in some of our areas because I mentioned I want to plant some new things. Well, of course, the trees go out in the yard, but I want some more perennials and things. And so I need to kind of relocate some things so I have a little more space as well.
Well, we are going to talk about what to plant or how to plant, and it's kind of like a primer on planting all the different kinds of things in your yard. And we're going to start off with annuals. And one of the things that's interesting here that you point out, like one of the very first things you do is you go to a store and you pick out a really nice annual and you bring it home. And the first thing you do is you cut it. You make it less than, and that just seems counterintuitive. But tell people exactly what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Here.
So when I take home a little pack of marigolds or a pack of petunias, and of course usually they're blooming because blooms sell.
Yep.
You can.
That's why you buy them.
Yeah, you can see what color they are, and get an idea of if that's for sure what you want. But when I get those home, like a little pack of marigolds or a little pot of wave petunias that I'm going to put either in a planter or plant out into the flower bed itself, the first thing I do is I take a scissors and I cut off all the blossoms. Now, I got that tip from my mom because that's what she always did. And I remember when I was getting into gardening kind of maybe more seriously, I suppose junior high, and I thought, man alive, she's cutting off all the good stuff. And it just seemed, tragic to me. But then I saw what that did because my mom had learned that by cutting off those blossoms, those first blossoms off of your little cell packs, that the energy would go into the plant, rooting in, making a healthier, huskier, broader plant, well-branched, and in the long run, it produced so much more blossom. And so it really does work. You see, an annual flower's goal in life is to blossom, produce seed, and then it's regenerated, propagated itself for the next generation, and then it signals it that, well, there, my job is done, and it'll start going downhill. So if you allow them to bloom too quickly and set seed, the little plant thinks its mission in life is done, and it's not going to really spread and thrive that much. So there is some good science. Now, if you don't cut off that blossom, it doesn't mean it's going to die, but it just doesn't develop as much. I remember in the greenhouse once, we had an employee that said, well, I'm going to try that. So they planted one petunia, didn't cut it back, had the little scraggly blossom on top. Yeah, I call it scraggly. The first blossoms, they're pretty, but really that just gives us a little hint.
Right.
Better things are to come. Okay, so he planted the one not cutting it back. The other one he did cut back, and about middle of the season, he said, wow, he could see for himself that it really did make a difference. And so I'm a firm believer of removing those. In fact, there's a garden center in Minnesota that has large display gardens, and they have done videos showing what they do when they plant out these it's at Fertile, Minnesota. And when they plant out these large display gardens, there's a video of them with the shears just cutting all the blossoms off and then planting it. And it is remarkable. Also, some of the plants, if you pinch out the little centers, they're called, the little growing points. For example, on a zinnia, little zinnia transplant, if you pinch out that little central growing point, the leaves we're talking about, it will branch out. Where you had one little growing point, you pinch out the center, and two come up. So right there, you've doubled the amount of plant that you've got. And so that works very well, too. And sometimes when you're cutting off the blossoms, things, too, sometimes you're also cutting off that growing point, which in turn allows them to branch out and bush out and become more prolific.
And you said that that's more for like the stockier plants?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and most bedding plants, that works very well. I should mention, though, that some of the larger potted bedding plants, such as geraniums, you buy those in a fairly, maybe 4.5-inch pot, either square or round. They've already been pinched and groomed in the greenhouse. Mm-hmm. And so there's really no need when you get a beautiful blooming geranium home, there's no need to remove that. They've done that a long time ago to create this nice, beautiful plant. So yes, take your geraniums home. They're blooming beautiful. Just pot them on up. Even I don't have the heart to take those off because there's really no point in that. And also, if you buy a fairly large potted petunia, for example, kind of the instant color type, those have been sheared and pinched. They've done that for you. But the little cell packs, I'm a firm believer in getting rid of those first blossoms.
How about let's talk about how to plant, as far as planting depth. What are the things?
Yeah, when we actually get those plants home and decide where to plant them. Now, most annual flowers, petunias, marigolds, zinnias, celosia, impatiens, all of those should be planted at about the depth that they are currently in the cell pack, but just a little deeper. The little root ball, little soil ball, should be down below your potting mix or your garden soil.
Okay.
If it's not planted, if that little root ball soil isn't covered with your other potting mix or soil, the moisture will wick on up and out. So be sure that little soil ball is covered.
Is that what they call kind of crowning, or having a crown where it kind of sits up above a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
To make sure that the little root ball is covered. Another common question is when you're planting, either in a container or out in the flower bed, and if you take the plant out of the little cell pack or its pot, do you break the roots up a little? Because sometimes when you'll take a petunia out of a little cell pack, the roots will be really tightly wound around. That's pretty common. And what I like to do, if it looks like they're really, really tightly wound around, I like to just with my finger gently pull them apart, tease the roots apart, not so much that you're breaking roots or disturbing them too much, but I like to just unwind them a little bit and then plant immediately. Also, if that cell pack of plants or potted plants, if they're dry before, water them well before you're planting so that you're not planting a dry, kind of dry wilted plant.
Water them in the cell pack?
And then, water them in the cell pack or pot first before you plant. If they're dry, if they're already wet, they're fine. And then immediately after planting, water again. Very important because that settles the soil around the root ball and then gives the surrounding soil good moisture. I should mention if you're planting in you mentioned kind of having it crowned up a little bit, the soil. If you're planting in a flower bed, it's kind of the opposite. The finished product around a little petunia plant in a flower bed should be, so it has a little saucer in it. So then when you go to water, that water will go right down around. So in a flower bed, you actually want a little depression or cup around each flower.
Around kind of the exterior, but still, okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
So you want the root ball covered, but the final situation is so that is has a little depression to hold some water.
So you just kind of press in a little bit, just gently around that.
Perfect.
Yeah, because you don't want too much because you don't want water to totally pool in there. You just want a little bit in there.
So that when you water, the right amount will go right down around the root system.
That's great. Okay, so one of the big things, I think we've talked about this all the time. You say the plant that you get asked, the types of plants you get asked the most about, tomatoes.
Yes, blossom end rot particularly.
Yeah, so let's talk about tomato plants.
Tomatoes are the number one homegrown vegetable in all of America. It's been number one for many, many years. And so, how to plant a tomato. They're a fascinating vegetable because they will root all along the stem. So if the stem is buried down in the soil, they'll root from that stem and then you get more root system. So when a person's planting tomatoes, if you plant them deeply, and you can even remove that bottom set of leaves a little bit. Sometimes they're kind of yellow anyway. You can remove those lower and then plant it. Old Professor Neil Holland always said, plant it up to its ears. So I repeat that. I had somebody ask me, ears, but kind of right up to the set of nice, healthy leaves, kind of that bunch of leaves, which means bearing the stem. And if you dug that up after 2 or 3 weeks, you would find out that it is rooted all along that stem. So you've increased the rooting, and that increases the vigor. The other thing that it does is it prevents the wind whipping.
Oh, sure.
If you didn't plant a tomato deep enough, if you just barely covered the little root ball, a lot of it is sitting up there, subject to the wind. And so setting it down in always works well. Do you put coffee cans around your tomato plants?
We don't. We maybe should because of the squirrels we get to them by. I don't know if that'll stop them, but yeah.
Yeah, luckily I don't have squirrels that go, but I put coffee cans around. The metal coffee cans are getting harder to find.
They are harder.
Yeah, they're getting, most of the coffee I buy now is in a plastic container. But if you can find a larger can, that works so well to put down for a week or so just to, buffer the wind.
Do you stake your tomato plants like with a wood stake, like as soon as you plant them, or?
Yes. Any of the types that are indeterminate means they grow indiscriminately with lots of vine. And then, yes, the stake should be put down in, or a cage if you use that. They should be put down fairly soon after planting because those things grow fairly rapidly. And I've tried to squeeze a tomato plant into a cage after the fact, and that doesn't go so well.
Yeah, you're always concerned about you're going to break a limb.
Exactly. So yes, the sooner the better for putting those on. So tomato plants, deep planting.
That always kind of, because we were talking about other ones, to plant right at the level, of where they are in the pack, where they are in the thing. Don't plant them. But tomato plants, really, it's okay to have a little bit deeper.
And that is probably in annual flowers, vegetables, perennial flowers. Tomatoes are probably the exception, a lone exception, because other types of things, if you plant too deeply, for example, if you got a petunia or marigold planted too deeply, the stem could rot. And we'll talk about vegetables in a minute. But for example, if you took a pepper plant and planted it as deep as you do tomatoes, the stem will likely rot. So tomatoes are kind of an exception. Other things you can maybe plant a hair deeper, like petunias, hair deeper. But, we're not planting it, 3 to 4 inches deep like you would a tomato. The other thing on tomatoes too, sometimes I'm asked the question, if a tomato plant has gotten really big, people have heard that you can lay them in a trench. And you can. Yep. If it's too deep vertically to plant it down in or dig down in, you can dig a little trench and gently, bury the stem horizontally, lay it down in a trench, and then gently bring the top of the tomato up and then fill in with soil, so that you don't kink it and break it. Mm-hmm. But do pay attention to which direction you laid that down in, because I've done that and come along with a hoe when weeding and pulled the whole thing out because the stem and root was at a little distance from the top that was sticking out. So, but that can be done too if you buy tomatoes maybe later on, late May, early June, when some of the tomatoes at the garden center are big, you can bury them like that.
All right, let's take a quick little break. And like you said, we'll come back and we'll talk about vegetables.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
All right, we're back and we're talking about how to plant the plants that you're going to be planting in your garden. That time of year where we're really looking forward to it. We're just about at the time to get our hands dirty, do some digging. We've been talking about annuals and tomato plants. But let's talk about vegetables now. What are the things that we should know about planting vegetables?
Well, some vegetables are planted from actual plants because if you direct seeded the seed out in the garden, they just take too long. And of course, we already talked about tomatoes. You plant plants. The same is true with cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli. If you direct seeded them, they just take too long. So we plant plants that you got from garden center or some you started yourself. So cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. Do you like Brussels sprouts?
I've really learned to like them over the last decade.
Okay, keyword there. I'm learning to like them. If they're prepared the right way.
Oh, yeah. Well, I do like them probably, I'm sure people would say in the unhealthier way, which is like pan fried with a little bit of fat and butter, salt. Yes.
Butter and salt. So anyway, those are cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, we plant plants. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so when you're planting those out, they can go just a little deeper so that you're covering the little soil ball of plants, but also just a little deeper helps the wind prevents the wind from kind of whipping them quite so much. So it gives a little more sturdiness to them. And so those are planted by plants. Then another group of vegetables can be planted either by plants or by seed. For example, cucumbers, muskmelon, watermelon, squash, pumpkins. You can direct seed those out into the garden, but you get a head start if you go with plants.
Yeah.
And the garden centers do sell cucumber plants and squash plants and melon plants. One thing about all of these, though, the vine crops, they don't like the roots to be disturbed. So when you're getting them out of the little plastic pot and planted, don't pull them apart the way we would have. Yeah. Okay. For some reason, they don't like to have their roots monkeyed with. That's why sometimes the commercial growers will oftentimes plant them in peat pots or a pot that you could do pot and all.
Okay.
So that you're not disturbing
the pot will decompose.
them. Yeah, exactly. So that you're not disturbing those roots anymore. So a person should be aware that those types of plants, again, the vine crops, are quite sensitive to disturbing the roots. So if you do, those will give you a head start, but just caution with the roots. Okay, they also could be direct seeded out into the garden. I will start melon plants, or I plant plants to give me a head start. Cucumbers, you can get a good crop of cucumbers just by planting the seeds. Same with squash, pumpkins. So those, I just plant the seeds. Now, I remember my mom always saying that we're going to plant these in a hill. Okay, so some people think that planting them in a hill means a little mound of soil, but that's not what a hill means in this old gardening talk. A hill means a grouping.
Okay.
For example, if you planted cucumbers in a little hill of soil, well, they'd dry out quickly, and the seed might not sprout unless you kept it really, really wet, because that hill would just tend to lose moisture. And so a hill means a little grouping. So cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, oftentimes we'll plant in a little group of maybe four seeds or 6 seeds. So that's what a hill means. So if you see that, plant your cucumbers in a hill, sometimes it'll say that on a seed pack, but it means a grouping and not a physical little mound. And so let's see what else, along with the vegetables. Oh, I should mention cutworms. When you're planting things like cabbage, cauliflower, tomatoes, cutworms are a nuisance. They're little larvae down in the, not so little, they're kind of fat. They're a fat grub. And they will, at soil line, cut off plants. It's disappointing to come in the morning and find out your tomato plant is just laying there detached. And of course, that's cutworms. If you scrape away the soil around, you'll oftentimes find that fat worm that curls up in a C shape. And so until the plants get a little larger, if you've been bothered with cutworms in the past, you might put a ring of plastic or a tuna can, cut the bottom out of that, a barrier. And it just has to be about 1 inch above soil and 1 inch or so below. I found cutting plastic milk jugs up into a little band, so maybe 4 inches, 2 inches above, 2 inches below, and forming that little band and putting that down around the plant. It doesn't have to be tight, but kind of around that plant, and then that prevents the cutworms from getting it. After the plant is, fairly established, then the cutworms are not an issue.
How about let's go into some of the really, really tasty fruits like strawberries.
Strawberries. Oh, gosh. I am so hungry for a fresh strawberry out of our garden. And so strawberry plants are sold a couple of ways. You might find them at the garden center in a little bunch of bare root plants that they maybe have had refrigerated, or maybe you'll find them already growing in little pots or packs. Now, the planting depth of strawberries is quite critical. There is a crown called a crown. That's the area between the leaves and the roots. There's kind of a little stem, little kind of solid stem. That's the crown. And that crown on a strawberry has to be right about at ground level. Not buried too deep and not sticking up too high. So that crown should be situated right below. So the leaves are above, the roots are down the soil, and that crown is right about at ground level. If it's too deep, then things don't go so well. And so, gosh, good planting time for strawberries.
Yeah. Well, it'd be a good time to plant them, and soon enough, good time to eat them. How about some blossoms like on some newer strawberries? There's something
good
there.
Point. Yes, because the newly planted strawberries, and maybe even they're blooming in the pot or pack that you buy them in, that should be removed.
So another one that should be.
Exactly, because if they set that blossom and fruit too soon, that's going to take all the energy. Instead, we're in it for the long haul. So for at least the first half of the summer, the blossom should be removed. And of course, the first year, you'll probably get some fruit the second half of the summer, but then next year for sure. So it's kind of an investment into the future a little bit, but you should the second half of the summer get fruit as well. But that first blossom for the first half of summer, then do remove.
And so a strawberry plant will, once it's up and going, it will produce all the way through the summer? I mean, once it's up?
Yep. It depends on the type.
Okay.
There are June-bearing types and there are ever-bearing types. The ever-bearing types have crops both in early summer and kind of throughout the summer. The June-bearing types only bear in June. And so if you take off the first flush of blossoms on that, then in middle of summer, even though it says June, it's probably July or so for us.
Let's go into another one. This is me. I always think of this as a regional favorite, but I think it's probably available everywhere, and it's probably a favorite of a lot of people everywhere. But it can be. Maybe it's an acquired taste. Rhubarb.
Rhubarb. We live in a wonderful area, the northern United States, because they can't grow decent rhubarb down in Texas.
Really? Is it just the too hot?
Lilacs don't do so well in warm areas, and even apples. Our Honeycrisp apples do not do well in the southern states. Many of our adapted materials need cold winters.
Okay.
And so lilacs, rhubarb, many of the apples do much better here than they do in other parts. Just think what it would be like without rhubarb.
Well,
I'm glad we live here.
About rhubarb and lilacs. Those are kind of like the first things that we see, right? I
Exactly.
mean, like my rhubarb's really coming in pretty nicely already, and lilacs.
Lilacs have buds.
Yeah, exactly.
Flower buds.
Pretty soon they'll be really fragrant.
Yeah, I can see the flower buds starting to come out of the tips already. So so awesome. So rhubarb. If you've got some that you want to divide, it can be done now. Do it quickly. Don't let them get too big. That's what I'm trying to say. Get them while they're little. So if you want to dig, divide, move, share, do it fairly soon. Or the other time you can wait till September. That's good too. But if you're looking to buy rhubarb from a garden center, it can be potted. Again, you'll find them in a plastic nursery pot, and they can be planted really all summer. That's what's nice about the plastic nursery pots. Is you can plant these things all summer long, really. So, and of course, I like the red rhubarb. The rhubarb with a nice cherry or just strawberry red look. Yeah, exactly. So if you've got one of the older green large stalk type, maybe you want to invest in one of the newer. Well, actually, they aren't so new. Do you know that I've got a rhubarb that is it is absolutely strawberry red, beautiful. And I got that from my parents. I moved it from their yard. They moved it from my mother's garden between Fingal and Alice, North Dakota. And Grandma got that from the Gurney's catalog, I think in the 1930s. And so actually those red varieties have been around quite a while.
Well, you were talking about if you want to buy a new red plant or, plant. The thing with rhubarb, though, is that if you plant it one year, you really shouldn't, you can't really count on harvesting it, right?
Good point. Very important point, because rhubarb needs some time to develop a good root system and to develop lots of good energy into that crown. So the first year of planting, don't harvest. Second year of planting, don't harvest. And the third year, you can begin harvesting rhubarb. Yeah, asparagus is the same way. It takes that long for it to really develop into a good plant. And if you're harvesting too early, you're taking away the plant's energy. And of course, with rhubarb and asparagus, we're in for the long haul. They'll be there 100 years later.
Like you were just talking about.
Exactly.
With that in mind, that you want them to have their root system. And what does that mean for if you move it? Like you were saying that if you want to move a rhubarb plant, now's the time to do it. If you move a rhubarb plant, can you still harvest it if it's 3 years old? Can you move it and still harvest it that summer?
Yep, the roots have been disturbed. So again, I follow the same procedure.
Okay.
Yep, when I move a rhubarb plant, no harvest this year.
Okay.
No harvest next year. So I try to exercise patience.
Yep.
And be in it for the long haul.
Well, rhubarb's worth
Sometimes
the
it's
patience.
hard.
I think
it's hard to wait.
I think a rhubarb is worth it. And I think some people are concerned about that the leaves cannot be consumed. They are not. They are not.
That's interesting.
Consumed.
In World War I, when vegetables, the Victory Gardens of World War I, and produce was at a premium, and so there was actually some poisoning, not death, but stomach type poisoning because people tried eating the leaves of rhubarb. But it has a toxic compound in it. If you ate enough, for example, if livestock ate enough, I think there have been some livestock deaths. But yeah, the leaves are not to be eaten. That brings up the point too. If rhubarb is frosted, if we get a May frost and the rhubarb is advanced, there's a rumor that goes around that rhubarb then, if it's exposed to frost, that it's poisonous. Well, there is some science behind that the toxic compound is kind of an alkaloid that would move from the leaves down into the stalk, which of course the stalk is edible. And so there's an easy way to tell whether your rhubarb is safe, if it's up and growing and we get a May frost. And it's this: if the leaves are blackened by frost, then don't use the rhubarb. Just pull it out. What regrows is going to be fine. Okay. So if the leaves are blackened, don't eat it. If everything is limp from frost, how things get called limp after a May frost damaged, then don't eat it. Just pull it all out. It'll regrow fine. And so frosted rhubarb, that sounds like a dish.
Yeah.
So if rhubarb has been exposed to freezing temperatures in May, if it still looks normal and no damage, then it's fine. Nothing has moved down into the stalks. And of course, a person always wants to err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
If you're nervous at all about it, just pull it out. It'll regrow. And the next batch is fine.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Rhubarb will regrow very, very fast because
it does from established rhubarb. It grows back nicely.
Basically, I think that we've talked about this. I think last year is that pretty much by about the 4th of July, you can kind of taper off, just let it grow because you want it to store up all that energy for the next year. So really the window for harvesting rhubarb is about 6 weeks to...
Yeah, it is.
Is it relatively
short?
And
so, why after July 4th, why don't we harvest rhubarb? And, rhubarb is very good to us in the spring of the year and the first half of summer. Gosh, it lets us pick off all its leaves and stalks so we can have good rhubarb crisp and everything else and pie. And we need to be kind to the rhubarb then after July 4th. We need to let the leaves grow so it can do its photosynthesis thing, recharge itself after we've plucked off all its stuff. And so that's why, from July 4th on, you could, if you want a pie later on, go ahead. But generally, let that plant regrow to re-energize itself. It's all about the photosynthesis thing. We got to let its leaves stay on. And if you continually harvested rhubarb all summer long, year after year, you could see the plant decrease in vigor. We don't want that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about perennial flowers.
Yes, perennial flowers. When we buy perennial flowers, most of them are potted up and actively growing in our friendly plastic nursery pot. And so when planting them, the key is mostly to plant them just slightly deeper than they were in the pot so that your garden soil is covering up that soil ball. The soil ball should never be visible. We always want to make sure that that is covered. And if the roots are really intertwined and wound around, then probably just tease them apart a little bit. Most perennials love organic matter. So if you amend the soil that you're going to backfill and amend the soil, peat moss is great, compost. Most perennials really thrive in organic matter. So if your soil's sandy, organic matter is great. Our heavy clay soils, amending them with peat moss. Perennial flowers don't send out their root systems very far. They're not going to send out root systems 3 feet. They're going to keep their root system in probably 18 to 24 inches. So if you concentrate on some peat moss and things kind of in that locale right around the perennial, that's where most of the roots are going to stay, and it will really enjoy that organic matter.
All right. We were talking about blossoms. Should we be concerned about blossoms on when you plant again, cutting those back?
Yes, and excuse me, I know this is hard, but when we buy a new perennial and get it home, and oftentimes they're blooming, because the blooms let us know. But for example, a peony, a brand new peony potted up that we take home, the best thing you can do for that is cut off that blossom, 1 or 2 blossoms, because again, that will allow the strength to go into the plant. And long term, it's better off. So I know it's hard, but for perennials that you buy and plant, again, perennials are meant to be there for years and years.
Yep.
So cut off the blossoms, and if you leave the blossom on, it's not going to die. But it's much better for it if the first year, cut off the blossoms. The second year, on things like peonies, cut off the blossoms again and let all that strength go in.
And it's really right there in the name perennial. Think about this, that these are investments, that you're buying this not just for how it looks right now, but for how it's going to look in 3 years.
Yeah, for on these perennials, if you wanted instant color, that's called an annual. If you wanted color for this season, that's an annual's job. And perennial, so I know it's tough, but cut off those blossoms.
Yeah.
Of perennials that first year, and I think the second year.
All right, let's take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about shrubs and trees.
The cold cases you see at the Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At the Vault podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, we're back and we're talking about planting in the garden, things to do, things to look out for. Let's talk about shrubs. If you've got space, shrubs are kind of a great way to not just fill in an area, but really you can get a lot of color, you can get a lot of texture, you can build, that could be like your like an anchor in a garden.
What would our landscapes be like without shrubs?
I know, yeah.
It'd be pretty dull. And so anyway, for shrubs, when we look at planting them, again, most are sold in our friendly little nursery pot. In the spring of the year, sometimes you can get bare root shrubs. Bare roots are actually easier to plant because you dig the hole and just kind of feather out the roots, backfill. Potted shrubs, we have to watch so that the roots aren't all circled. And that's very common. You slip the shrub out of the nursery pot, the roots naturally are probably circled around in, and we need to tease those roots outward, because if you just plant it as is, in a big kind of circling root clump, a lot of those roots are going to kind of stay in that little circle. And so by just gently, by hand, pulling those roots out, tease that root ball apart, and then plant slightly deeper than they were in that nursery pot. And doing that is very important. If it was dry, when you bought it, and maybe you bought it the day before, and etc. But make sure it's well watered before you plant, and then after you plant, water again. Water thoroughly. Maybe a 5-gallon bucket. 3 to 5 gallons on a shrub to really soak it in. That does a couple of very important things. That gets rid of air pockets. Roots can't bridge air pockets.
Okay.
So if there's, especially in our heavy clay soil, man, you try to backfill a hole with this heavy soil, a lot of it's clumpy, and you can just tell it's not all sifting down in nicely. And by watering the shrub thoroughly afterwards, and it helps to leave a little depression around, plant it so that it's situated a little bit lower than the surrounding, so that there's a dish around it to hold water. And 3 to 5 gallons will get rid of the air spaces. It'll cause the soil to, kind of go in between the little crevices. And so watering thoroughly is really important. Then you maybe won't have to water for another week or so on a lot of these.
But
if you're planting middle of summer, might have to water more often.
But obviously, if you're using like a 3 or 5 gallon bucket, you don't want to just dump it all in there. Once it extends, it's just going to spill all over. It could do some damage there. You really kind of want to still be a little patient with it. You just kind of spread it around.
Maybe pour on half, let that soak down, pour on the other half, and then you'll know that it's well watered and you're getting rid of those air pockets and having good root to soil contact, which is so very, very important. And a lot of these same things are true with trees that you plant. Now, shrubs, the planting depth is a little more lenient, not quite as critical. Trees, very important on the planting depth. And we've really learned this over the last 20 or 30 years because we've examined trees that have just toppled over, trees that are maybe 10, 15, 20 years old that in a wind have snapped off at ground line. And we've examined those and found that they were planted too deeply. And so that point where they entered the ground has become weakened. And boy, how tragic to have a tree end like that, years and years before. And so the proper planting depth is this. Okay, in the pot in which, when you get the tree home, take a look and look for kind of the widened part of the trunk. It kind of goes pretty much straight down. And then at the base of the trunk, there will be a flare as it flares out. And then even dig down in the pot a little bit. Look for the uppermost main root that comes off the trunk. That uppermost main root, should be just below soil surface when you're done planting. So dig your hole, so that with all that in mind, so that the final product will have the uppermost root. I know this sounds kind of like, splitting hairs, but it's really important. And so that uppermost main root should be just below soil surface. And the other thing is when your tree is all planted and situated at a depth so it's in a slight depression, so when you pour your 5 gallons of water on, it's not going to all just run off, but in a slight depression. And when it's all done, you should see the flared out bottom of the trunk. If the tree goes into the ground straight as a telephone pole, it's concerned. For example, we observe a lot of trees that are having problems, and one of the first things that we look at is that tree going straight into the ground, the trunk, like a telephone pole, because they should have that flared out, a little bit wider portion as it enters the ground. And if it doesn't have that, it's a pretty good indication that it was planted too deeply. And then the soil was up on a trunk, and it only has to be maybe 4 inches too deep and causes major problems down the road.
So when you're talking about a telephone pole, that it shouldn't look like that, you're not just saying that it shouldn't be up straight, but you're saying that where the ground meets the tree, it shouldn't be a right angle. It should not be a 90-degree angle. There should be that flare there. Yep,
exactly. So, you know how a telephone pole goes in pretty much the same diameter all the way down, straight down at the ground.
Okay,
yep. And so if the trunk of a tree, especially, as it ages, if the trunk of the tree goes straight down in with pretty much that same diameter without it being a wider diameter at the ground level, then it's an indication that it probably was planted too deeply. So you should be able to see that flare, the little bit wider portion of the bottom of the trunk. You should see that visible above ground level. And then if you dig down a little bit, you'd see that uppermost main root coming off, and that would be just below soil surface. So that planting depth is very important. The second most important thing on planting trees especially is when they're taken out of the pot, the roots will be wound around in a circle, because that's kind of the way they grow in a pot. And so when we take the tree out of the pot, pull apart, tease apart the roots, pull them out, maybe even take a sharp butcher knife and cut down through those circling roots. Because if you don't do that, if you just take the tree out of its pot, plant it into the hole with all those circling roots, what we're finding is 10, 20, 25 years later, those circling roots are girdling the tree like a boa constrictor. The tree increases in trunk size, the roots increase, and pretty soon the circling roots are touching the tree. And I've got some wonderful photos. I should almost see if we could include those photos. Yeah. I've got some wonderful photos called stem girdling roots. The tree increased in diameter, the circling roots around, they increased diameter. The roots are now embedded in the trunk, and the whole tree was dying 20 years later. And so what a tragic end.
Yeah.
And so, pull the roots apart, tease them apart. And also, if you need, cut the circling roots so that they do not continue to grow in that circle. Because we don't want a boa constrictor around our trees.
No. And again, if we're talking about planting these things to be able to enjoy for years and years and years. Yeah, how frustrating would that be?
Just taken down, a beautiful maple, just taken down after, I think it was only 12 to 15 years, and that should have lasted, 100 years.
Yeah. That's really unfortunate.
Yeah, so don't want to end on a little downer. So let's talk about roses. Roses are beautiful. Planting roses.
Yes.
So when you buy rose bushes at the garden center, plant them deep. We talked about trees. Don't plant deep. Roses, plant deep as you can because they don't mind deep planting. And also, the deeper you plant your rose, meaning the soil will be up on the branches of the rose, because the deeper you plant them, the more winter hardy they become. And you get some natural soil kind of insulation on those. So roses plant really, really deep, such as a potted rose, sink it down so that the soil in the pot is 4 inches deeper down in, maybe even 6 inches deeper. So really, really deep on roses. Not on trees.
One more thing with talking about trees. Remember, like we've talked about this before, but I think like when you plant a tree, you get it planted in, and you kind of move dirt around it. One of the things too is that maybe you want to put a little mulch, like almost like a donut, around the exterior to give it. That'll help hold some water on the surface, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But hold some water there, and then also it creates a barrier so when you're mowing, you don't bump into this new tree.
Yeah, exactly. And you also reminded me of an important topic too on trees or shrubs, and that is the soil that we use to backfill. Okay, we dig the hole, we got the trees set down in, the soil we backfill. Are we supposed to kind of amend that something, add some peat moss, compost? And no. What they found out is if we make the soil in that hole too nice and lush, the roots don't want to go out into our heavy clay or the sand. They'll stay in that little.
They're not going to want to work for there.
No, they're gonna like to live in that little spot. And so just backfill with your native normal soil and don't amend it with anything. Roses are an exception. Don't you love all these exceptions? Do this with the trees, but don't do it with the roses. Okay.
Well, that's why we're talking about these things.
Exactly. Roses love the soil to be amended. We talked about perennials too. They love peat moss, organic material. Roses also love to have that soil amended. Lots of peat moss, lots of organic material. And then you bring up the good point about mulching, especially a tree, because grass is a tree's worst enemy. If the grass is allowed to creep up to the tree, well, if a string trimmer, got lots of cases where string trimmers have killed trees, and mowing, scarring them up. If you have a diameter of mulch, I like the shredded bark mulch, around a tree, makes mowing so much easier, and it keeps the grass away from that young little root zone, because grass robs a lot of fertility, a lot of moisture, and so somewhere 3 to 5. I like the 5-foot rule. 5 foot and 5 inches thick of mulch, and kept 5 inches away from the trunk so it doesn't rot the trunk.
Right. You don't want all that moisture from the mulch seeping into the tree. You want to kind of create that a little bit away.
Exactly. Because human nature, okay, if I say 5 feet, then when I'm actually doing it, maybe I get 3 to 4 feet. Okay. If I say 3 feet, maybe I'm only going to get a foot and a half. Okay. Old Professor Neil Holland, I used to write the 3-3-3 rule, and he said, increase it to 5 foot, because he said a lot of us maybe will taper it down and you'll get your 3 to 4 feet, but let's call it 5 and go from there. So good point, John.
Don, this has been great because it gives everybody kind of some tips for when we're ready to get into the garden and ready to do some planting. This is how we should be doing it. I'm
going to have a hard time going back to the office because I'm kind of in the mood to plant something.
I know. Don't you want to just, yes, exactly.
Yeah, but tonight I've got my eye on some perennials. I want a new plum tree.
Okay.
Another plum tree. So I've got my eye on a couple of those. Should mention too, one last comment. If there is danger of frost, and in May, we usually do get killing frosts, not always, but if anything has leafed out, then delay until damage of frost until frost is less likely.
Okay.
Because anything that you plant that has leaves, whether it's a tree, shrubs, perennial, if we do get a frost, those will be burnt back. If it's not leafed out yet, then go ahead and plant now, anytime. But yeah, anything that is leafed out, including trees, even though they're winter hardy, if we get a spring frost, those leaves would be burnt back.
All right. Well,
Great.
Let's talk about one thing here. We got Mother's Day coming up. We're talking about an idea for a Mother's Day show. We'd like to hear from listeners about what they learned from their mother, or if you are a mother, what things in the garden, like maybe what tools, what would make a good Mother's Day gift.
Yeah, exactly. Some gifts that mothers would actually enjoy, so we could kind of give some hints out. But yeah, some of the things that people learned from their mothers.
Yeah,
tips,
or memories that you have,
tips,
or if you
memories.
have a plant that reminds you of your mother, let's hear from that. And so if people have those, or if people have more questions about how to plant, or want or pictures of anything to share with pictures. You, what's the best way to reach you?
My email is donald.kinzler, spelled Kinzler, @ndsu.edu.
All right.
That should be great to hear from you. We've all learned so much. Many people have just tremendous tales of things that they learned from their mothers and grandmothers in gardening.
Yeah, that'll be a fun show.
It will.
All right. Well, Don, we'll see you next week where we'll talk about mothers in the garden.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for listening.